Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really impactful legal document,
Okay.
the judgment in the Ugandan case against 13 individuals accused of the 2010 Kampala bombings.
Right.
It's a long and detailed document, but stick with us. We're here to pull out the most fascinating parts and really bring this case to life for you.
Yeah. We're going to be looking at how the Ugandan court defined terrorism, the evidence that connected these individuals to the bombings,
Mhm.
and all the legal arguments that came into play during the trial.
Now, you might be thinking, why does this matter to me? Well, this case goes way beyond just a tragic terrorist attack. It gives us a look into how an entire country grapples with terrorism, the complexities of the legal process, and the human stories that are at the very heart of it all.
And we can't forget the setting. These bombings targeted people watching the World Cup final. Imagine that, gathering with friends to enjoy a game,
Yeah.
and then suddenly this horrific attack unfolds.
It's just heartbreaking. The judgment really paints a picture of the chaos and the devastating aftermath. 72 people were killed and so many others injured, but beyond the tragedy itself, the document dives into the investigation, and it's like reading a detective novel.
It really is. You see investigators using eyewitness accounts, phone records, even DNA analysis to piece together this incredibly complex puzzle and connect the accused individuals to the bombings.
Okay, so let's get into some of the specifics. One detail that really stood out to me was about Hussein Hassanagad, one of the accused. Investigators found a phone at a house in McKindy and believe it belonged to him. Here's the crazy part. This phone was actually connected to an unexploded bomb.
And that wasn't all. The phone records showed communication with several other numbers, some of them in Kenya. It opened up a whole new dimension to the investigation, suggesting a wider network involved in the plot.
It's almost like that phone became a key that unlocked a much bigger mystery. Speaking of Kenya, the judgment mentions two key witnesses who provided a lot of detail about the plot. But get this, they were actually accomplices who admitted to taking part in the attacks.
Yeah, that's accomplice testimony for you. It can be pretty tricky in legal cases. Think about it, these individuals are admitting to their own involvement, so there's always a question of whether they're trying to minimize their role or maybe even shift blame onto others.
So how do you know if you can trust their testimony? I mean, there's so much at stake in a case like this.
That's where things get interesting. The judgment actually goes into great detail about how the court handled this. They didn't just take the accomplice's word for it. They looked for corroborating evidence from other sources to back up their claims.
So they needed evidence from other sources to confirm what the accomplices were saying.
Exactly. They were looking for things like phone records, eyewitness accounts, physical evidence from the scene, anything that could independently support the accomplice's version of events.
Uh-huh.
It's all about making sure the judgment is fair and just, especially when the consequences are so serious.
That makes a lot of sense. But this case also raises another fascinating question. How do you actually define terrorism in a legal context? It's got to be more complicated than just saying someone committed a violent act.
You're absolutely right. The judgment dives right into that thorny issue. It explores how the Ugandan court interpreted their Anti-Terrorism Act to figure out if Al-Shabaab, the group claiming responsibility for the bombings, even qualified as a terrorist organization under the existing law at the time.
So they had to prove that al-Shabaab met the legal definition of a terrorist organization before they could even move forward with terrorism charges.
Yeah,
That seems like a crucial step.
it was. And it wasn't as straightforward as you might think. The judgment talks about how the court looked at legal dictionaries, international conventions, basically anything that could help them decide if al-Shabaab fit the specific criteria outlined in Ugandan law.
And what did they conclude?
Well, it's interesting. Despite all the evidence of al-Shabaab's violence, the court initially determined that they didn't meet the exact requirements of the Ugandan law at that time.
Wait, so they were carrying out these horrific acts, but legally speaking, couldn't be classified as a terrorist group. That seems like a pretty big loophole.
You've hit on a really important point. It just goes to show how legal definitions can sometimes lag behind the reality of these evolving threats, like we're seeing with terrorism today.
It makes you wonder, how do we keep laws up to date with the challenges of the world today? I mean, this case could have major implications for how we interpret terrorism in the future.
You're absolutely right. This case is like a window into how the legal world is grappling with these new and complex threats.
It's definitely more than just a historical event. But let's not forget the human side of this story. The judgment mentions Muzaffar Louima, who was found guilty not of directly participating in the bombings,
Right.
but for helping his brother escape afterward.
That's right. His brother was involved in the bombings, and Muzaffar helped him get away. It's a heartbreaking example of how families can be torn apart by these events and the impossible choices people face when loyalty clashes with the law.
It just shows that within this complicated legal document, there are real people grappling with unimaginable situations. And for you listening, it's a reminder that these legal cases aren't just abstract concepts. They involve real people, real families, real consequences.
Exactly. But let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the role of science in this case, because forensic evidence seems like it played a big role in the investigation.
You know, like you see on those crime shows with DNA analysis and all that. It's not just fiction, it's real life detective work.
Absolutely. The judgment really highlights how important forensic analysis was in building a solid case against the accused.
So how did they use it? Give us some examples.
Well, for instance, the FBI played a crucial role in examining the improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, that were used in the attacks. They were able to link them to similar devices found in Somalia, which strengthened the connection to al-Shabaab.
So international collaboration, scientific expertise, it all played a part in connecting the dots.
Exactly. And there's more. Remember how we talked about that house where they found the phone connected to the unexploded bomb? Well, investigators also found a mattress cover there, and they did DNA testing on it. The results linked Isa Ahmed Louima, another key figure in the plot, directly to that location.
Wow, so they had physical evidence placing him right where they believe the bombs were being put together? That's a pretty damning piece of evidence.
It was, and when you combine that with the phone records, the eyewitness accounts, and the testimony from those accomplices, you start to see how a very solid case was built against him and some of the other accused. It was like putting together a giant, complicated puzzle, with each piece of evidence adding more to the picture.
It's amazing how all these different pieces come together. Eyewitness accounts, phone records, DNA analysis, it all adds up to paint a clearer picture of what happened. But this judgment goes beyond just these individuals, right?
That's what's so fascinating about this case. It highlights some much broader challenges, things we're still dealing with today.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, think about the struggle to legally define terrorism. That's a global issue we're still grappling with.
Yeah.
Then there's the complexity of international cooperation in investigations like this. You've got Kenyan and Ugandan authorities working together, the FBI getting involved. It shows how interconnected these investigations are.
It underscores how these threats don't respect borders. Terrorism is a global issue that requires global solutions.
Exactly. And then you have this delicate balance between security concerns and individual rights. It's a complex web of issues that this case brings to the forefront. And it's a reminder that even with all the legal arguments and forensic evidence, at the heart of this case are real people whose lives were forever changed by this tragedy.
It's easy to get lost in the details of the investigation, but we can't forget the human cost. The judgment describes the victims' injuries, the impact on their families, and the long road to recovery for those who survived. It's a stark reminder that this wasn't just a case, it was a horrific event that shattered lives.
Exactly. And the judgment also gives us a glimpse into how the court wrestled with some really tough legal questions. Remember those two key witnesses who admitted to being part of the plot?
Yeah, the accomplices. You mentioned earlier how tricky their testimony can be.
Right. Their accounts offered a valuable inside look at how the group operated and how they planned the attacks. But the court had to tread carefully. Imagine you're a judge in this case. Can you really rely on the word of someone who admits to being involved in such a horrific act?
I can see how that would be a dilemma. They might be tempted to downplay their own role, or even point fingers at others to get a lighter sentence.
Exactly. The judgment explains how the court meticulously scrutinized their statements, looking for any inconsistencies or signs that they might be manipulating the truth. But they didn't stop there. They also searched for corroborating evidence from other sources.
So they needed independent verification, like those phone records or eyewitness accounts we talked about earlier.
Precisely. They wanted to be absolutely sure that no one was convicted solely on the word of an accomplice. They needed multiple pieces of the puzzle to fit together before they could be certain. It really speaks to the court's commitment to a fair and just process.
That makes a lot of sense. But let's circle back to that question of defining terrorism. You mentioned how the court struggled with applying the existing Ugandan law to al-Shabaab. What were some of the specific challenges they faced?
Well, the Anti-Terrorism Act at that time was very specific about what constituted a terrorist organization. Basically, the group had to be officially listed as a terrorist organization within the law itself.
And al-Shabaab wasn't on that list. even though they had claimed responsibility for the bombings.
Nope, they weren't. It created a real legal hurdle. Even though there was plenty of evidence linking al-Shabaab to the attacks, the court couldn't technically convict the accused of belonging to a terrorist organization because, at that time, under Ugandan law, al-Shabaab wasn't officially classified as one.
So you're telling me they could commit these horrific acts but not be labeled as terrorists because of a technicality in the law? That seems crazy.
It does highlight the complexities of law and how it sometimes struggles to keep pace with real-world events. But the judgment itself acknowledges this gap. It notes that the Ugandan parliament actually amended the Anti-Terrorism Act after the trial to include al-Shabaab on the list of terrorist organizations.
Wow, so this case actually led to a change in the law. That's pretty impactful.
It is. It shows how a single case can expose flaws in legislation and drive important reforms. It also highlights the dynamic nature of law and how it constantly evolves to address new challenges. But let's not forget that this investigation involved more than just Uganda. We talked about those phone records connected to Kenya and the FBI's role. It seems like international cooperation was a big part of this story.
It makes you realize how interconnected the world is, especially when it comes to tackling these kinds of threats.
Absolutely. The judgment shows how crucial it was for different countries to work together. You have Kenyan and Ugandan authorities sharing information, coordinating efforts to track down suspects, and gathering evidence across borders. And then you have the FBI providing their expertise in analyzing the IEDs and helping to connect the dots.
It really underscores how combating terrorism requires a global effort. No single country can do it alone.
Right. It's a reminder that these threats don't respect national boundaries, and effective responses require collaboration on an international scale. But let's shift gears for a moment and focus on the individuals who were ultimately convicted in this case. What were some of the key pieces of evidence that sealed their fate?
Okay, so let's break it down. We've got Hussein Hassan Agad, the guy with the phone connected to the unexploded bomb. What else do we know about his involvement?
Well, that phone was like a gold mine for investigators. Not only did it physically link him to the bomb, but the records showed him communicating with other suspects and placing him at crucial locations related to the plot. Remember those calls to Kenya? That was Agada's phone.
So the phone records painted a pretty clear picture of his movements and connections. It's like a digital trail leading right to him.
Exactly. And remember that DNA evidence from the mattress cover we discussed earlier? Well, that directly connected Isa Ahmed Luima, another key player, to the house where they believe the bombs were assembled.
Ah, so they had physical evidence placing him right at the scene of the crime.
They did. And on top of that, you had the accomplice testimony corroborating his involvement. The investigators really built a solid case against him, using a combination of forensic science, witness accounts, and good old-fashioned detective work. It's like solving a complex puzzle. Each piece of evidence, whether from witnesses, phone records, or forensic analysis, helps to create a clearer picture of what happened.
And ultimately, the court found enough evidence to convict 7 of the 13 accused on charges of terrorism, murder, and attempted murder.
That's right. Based on the evidence presented, the judgment concludes that those 7 individuals played a significant role in planning and carrying out the Kampala bombings.
It's a stark reminder of the human capacity for both great evil and the relentless pursuit of justice. What happened to the others who were not convicted?
5 of the accused were acquitted due to insufficient evidence, meaning the prosecution failed to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
What about the other individual?
The remaining individual was already deceased by the time of the judgment.
This case has been a real roller coaster of emotions. It's horrifying to think about what happened, but it's also inspiring to see how a nation grapples with such a tragedy and strives for justice.
And it's a reminder that while justice can be pursued, the scars of such events run deep. Speaking of justice, let's discuss the sentences that were handed down in this case. The judgment doesn't shy away from acknowledging the gravity of the crimes committed.
Given the magnitude of the tragedy, I can only imagine the weight of those decisions. What did the court ultimately decide?
The court, recognizing the immense suffering caused, imposed the most severe penalties available under Ugandan law. 5 of those convicted, including Hussein Hassan Agadi and Isa Ahmed Luima, received life sentences.
Life imprisonment. That's a powerful statement about the severity of their crimes. What about the others who were found guilty? Did they receive similar sentences?
The sentences varied depending on the individual's role and the specific charges. For example, Hassan Haruna Luima, who was convicted of aiding and abetting his brother's escape, received a somewhat lighter sentence.
So his punishment was less severe than those who planned and carried out the bombings.
Yes. The court considered several factors in his case. His role was that of an accomplice, not a mastermind. He cooperated with the investigation, and he had already spent a considerable amount of time in detention while awaiting trial.
So the court took a more nuanced approach, recognizing that not everyone involved shared the same level of culpability.
Exactly. They aimed for a balance between accountability and fairness, recognizing the differences in each individual's actions.
And what about Muzaffar Luyima? His story, helping his brother escape, really struck a chord with me. What was his fate?
Muzaffar's case is particularly interesting. He was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact. But remember, he had already spent almost 6 years in pretrial detention. That's a significant amount of time, especially considering the maximum sentence for his crime.
So he had already served a considerable portion of any potential sentence before the trial even concluded. What did the court decide to do?
The court, taking his time served into account, chose a path focused on rehabilitation rather than further imprisonment. Muzaffar was sentenced to 1 year of community service.
Community service instead of prison. It sounds like the court saw potential for him to reintegrate into society and make amends for his actions.
That seems to be the underlying message. It highlights the idea that justice isn't always about the harshest punishment. Sometimes it's about finding a path towards healing and restoration.
It's a powerful reminder that there's a human element to these legal proceedings. The court, in this case, recognized that Muzaffar's actions, while serious, were driven by a complex mix of loyalty and fear.
It certainly adds another layer to this already multifaceted story. This deep dive has taken us through a maze of legal complexities, scientific analysis, and deeply personal human experiences.
It's been an emotional journey, to say the least. We've explored the horrific nature of the attacks, the painstaking investigation, the court's struggle to apply the law, and the far-reaching consequences for everyone involved.
And for you, the listener, we hope this deep dive has provided a new perspective on the Kampala bombings. It's a reminder that even within the dense language of legal judgments, we can find powerful narratives that illuminate the human condition and challenge our understanding of justice, terrorism, and the world we live in.
This case raises so many important questions. How do we define terrorism in an ever-changing world? How do we balance security concerns with individual rights? How do we ensure justice is served while also leaving room for compassion and rehabilitation?
These are questions we all need to grapple with, especially in a world facing complex and evolving threats. We hope this deep dive has equipped you with some new insights and sparked your curiosity to explore these issues further.
As we conclude this exploration of the Kampala bombing judgment, we leave you with one final thought to ponder. What are your own reflections on the use of accomplice testimony in cases like this? Is it ever justifiable to rely on the words of those who have admitted to participating in such acts?
It's a question that goes to the heart of our justice systems and the delicate balance between seeking truth and ensuring fairness for all. We encourage you to continue the conversation, delve deeper into these issues, and form your own informed opinions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.